I love storytelling. How many of you like stories? You like to listen to stories, read stories. Some of you, I know, really like to read books. I love reading fiction, nonfiction, doesn't matter. I love reading stories of some kind, historical stories, made-up stories. And I am what some people call a cinephile, which sounds like a bad thing, but it just means you love watching movies and TV shows. So I really love doing that and seeing story development and character development and all of those things. And the truth is, good storytelling of any kind always has good tension, it has good conflicts, and it has resolutions and character development and all of these things in the story. Some good stories even have what they like to call a surprise twist ending. How many of you like those in the story? Yeah, where you're like, what? Good things like Bruce Willis was dead the whole time, right? Stuff like that. If I spoiled a movie for you just now, you've had plenty of time to watch that movie, okay? So I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. But also good twist endings like, what has Obi-Wan told you about your father? He told me enough. He told me you killed him. No, I am your father, right? Great. And you're like, what? No way. Although I found out later, someone said, I don't remember what it was. I'm pretty sure it was from another movie that someone said, you should have known the whole time because Vader means father in German. But I didn't know that at the time. So it was a twist ending for me that you find out that Vader is Luke's father. But as you look through stories, there's these twist endings. And then something also that's in some good storytellings is what's called a MacGuffin. Does anyone know what a MacGuffin is? Yeah? Okay, a couple people? Sweet. So if you don't, you're learning something new this morning about storytelling. A MacGuffin is a prop in a story, but it's not merely a background prop. It's an important thing that is placed into the story early on in the story to foreshadow things that are to come. Another thing that's similar to a MacGuffin is what's called Chekhov's gun. And if you don't know what Chekhov's gun is, Chekhov was a playwright who had talked about this. If you're going to put a gun in scene 1 of the play, then it needs to shoot someone by scene 3 of the play. It shouldn't just be in the story for no reason. You need to use it. Everything in the story matters. That's really what it's trying to say. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of preparation to set the stage just right, whether it's a play, whether it's a movie, whether it's writing of a story, to work together all of these types of things to make a really good story. It takes preparation to set the stage in all of those ways. And the truth is, when we come to the book of Esther, Esther has all of those things. In fact, our passage this morning has a MacGuffin in it, okay? We'll talk about that in just a second. And later we will find out in the book of Esther that there is also a Chekhov's gallows, is what I call it, a Chekhov's gallows. If you know the story of Esther, then you know what that is. But there's a kind of a Chekhov's gun even in the story of Esther. And so I love this book. It's a great and grand story in the Bible as a whole. And chapter 1 of Esther really just sets the stage for all that is to come in the story. And so as we begin the sermon study through the book of Esther, I believe it would be good for us to learn some things that make up this story and really set the stage of what we're going to see as we uncover the whole story of Esther. But every story has characters in it, right? Characters are a big part of each story. So let's first of all get introduced to the major characters in this story of the book of Esther. One person that we're introduced to right at the beginning of this story is a king by the name of Xerxes. In our Bible, the title there is Ahasuerus. Now, Ahasuerus is just a term that means like your majesty. It's basically a title that they gave to Persian kings as they had. So Ahasuerus Xerxes is how it would be known. And so King Xerxes is most often the king that is associated with this story as you look to the history of it all. But when you hear Xerxes introduced in the story of Esther, what you're supposed to think when you hear his name is, wow. That's what you're supposed to think when you're introduced to this King Xerxes. Grandiose, power. Because at this time, right at the beginning, it tells us that this was when the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, was really at its greatest. It tells us right at the beginning that it went from India all the way to Ethiopia. And if you were to look at this map, it just took up a massive amount of space, the Persian Empire did. And the capital area of this huge and vast empire was in what we would know today as modern-day Iran. That's modern-day Iran is ancient day Persia. And so you go to Shushan, this citadel or this area where his palace was located. It would have been in what is now known as Iran. So we're introduced to this King Xerxes, and he was a king of kings. He was a king that was above a lot of other kings and rulers. In fact, he knows this. He called himself the King of Kings. That's what he called himself. Now, if I were to ask you, who is the King of Kings? You would answer, Jesus. Okay, we're going to practice that again, okay? If I were to say, who is the King of Kings? You would answer, Jesus, all right? The good Sunday school answer that every kid says, Jesus, for every answer. Okay, it's the right one. Jesus is the true King of Kings. So when the New Testament writers call Jesus the King of Kings, they're hearkening back to this king of history that they would have all known had called himself the King of Kings. And what the New Testament writers are telling us about Jesus is this man is so much greater than the one who you know to have, quote unquote, held that title. That Jesus is the true King of Kings. So we're introduced in the story to King Xerxes. And then we're introduced to this story to Queen Vashti, or Queen Vashti, however you want to pronounce it. She was married to Xerxes. She's the first wife of him, and she is best known really for what takes place in chapter 1 of the book of Esther. And we'll touch on that in just a moment. Another character that we're introduced to as you go throughout the story is a man by the name of Haman the Agagite. Now, we aren't going to be introduced to him in chapter number 1, but I'm kind of just laying the groundwork for us as we go through all of this. But Haman the Agagite is the villain of this story. He's the villain of the story of Esther. And when you hear him introduced in the story, you're supposed to go, boo, okay? That's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to boo the human of the story. And this is much more obvious to the original readers of the story. We, after reading the whole story, we would come to recognize him as the villain of the story. But the writer of Esther actually introduces Haman in a way that the original readers would have immediately picked up on. That's the villain. By calling him Haman the Agagite. He's introduced in chapter number 3 as an Agagite. Now, what this tells us is that he's a descendant of a man named Agag. And if you recognize names from the Bible, some of them are a little obscure, but Agag was an Amalekite king who was 500 years prior to the story of Esther taking place. He was king of the Amalekites, and the Amalekites were one of the ancient enemies of the Jews. And they tried to utterly and completely destroy the Jews back in the time of Moses. And so when Israel had a king, God had said to that king, who happened to be the first king of Israel, King Saul, wipe out all of the Amalekites. Do not leave anyone alive whatsoever. Kill the king, kill everyone. And the king at that time was a man by the name of Agag. So Saul was supposed to kill this man by the name of Agag. But what you find out from the story is that Saul did not kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He left him alive, and he had disobeyed God. And so because of these previous stories in Scripture, when the original readers would have come to the book of Esther, they would have read Haman the Agagite and immediately went, Agag, that's our ancient villain that's the villain of our history. And so Haman, this is a bad guy. This is immediately someone we should recognize as the villain. Another character that we're introduced to in the story of Esther is Mordecai, the Jew. Now Mordecai, he's a good man. He's not a great man by any stretch of the word, but he is a good man, and it tells us that a few different ways in the book of Esther. He is a great grandson of a man by the name of Kish. That's how he's introduced in this story. From the tribe of Benjamin. Now, who is in the tribe of Benjamin with the name of Kish? Well, we find out, if you read more of the Bible, that Saul, the king who was supposed to kill King Agag, was the son of Kish in the tribe of Benjamin. So in a good story, every word is intentional. So the writer of Esther is cluing us into the fact that somehow this descendant of Kish will be the undoing of this descendant of Agag, fulfilling what Saul should have done to Agag all those centuries before. And it's cool how it starts to unravel as we go through the story. And then the other character that we have in the story of the book of Esther is, of course, Esther herself. Esther, who becomes queen, this great hero of the story. She's an orphan. And we really see through this story her bravery, and we see her faith as we trace the story over the coming weeks. But there is one more character in the story. He's never mentioned even once in this entire book, but nonetheless, he is in this story, and that is God himself. God is the main character we know of the whole Bible, but all throughout the book of Esther, as you read, the name of God is not mentioned even once. And you might think, so this story isn't about God. But my friends, this story is all about God. The hidden hand of God is weaved throughout this entire story, even when God's name is not mentioned, and even though he doesn't seem to play a prominent role in the story, nothing takes place in the story of Esther without God putting it in place. And I pray that we'll see over the course of this series that the same is true about you and me. Everything in our lives, the huge, significant things that are turning points of certain aspects of our lives, or even the seemingly insignificant small details that become foreshadows of our own future story. Everything has been placed in our lives by the hand of God. Now, a little disclaimer or a warning as we go through this entire sermon series. This is not a children's story, as I said a moment ago. It's not a Disney fairy tale. There is a lot of moral ambiguity in the story of Esther. I don't know if you've ever watched a movie with someone and then something comes up you didn't know was in the movie, and it's like, whoa, now it's all awkward. Now it's embarrassing, right? That I'm watching this movie with them because I didn't know that this was a part of the movie. That'll happen in the story of Esther, okay? There will be some things that we see take place that you're like, oh, that's weird. It is, okay? It's not something that should have taken place, and that will happen multiple times in the story of Esther. The moral ambiguity in this story is rampant. There's a lot of drunken debauchery. Everybody's drinking. There's a lot of sex in this story. There's a lot of murder. There's assassination attempts. There's genocide all throughout this story, and it's not only the bad guys who are morally compromised. In fact, by the end of the story, you're going to find that there's really only one character in the entire story that remains absolutely pure and faithful in every moment, and that is God himself. So that's the characters of the story, but let's look at the setting of the story. Look at the setting of the story with me. Let's read those first 5 verses in chapter number 1. It says this: Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel, that in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan, the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now you read that, and what are we supposed to say when we hear about King Ahasuerus? We're supposed to think, wow. Right? Wow. This is a grandiose guy. This is a huge place. If you were to read through a little bit about Shushan, it was a huge citadel, a huge fortification. And within this citadel is a huge palace. And it really is big. In fact, you can go to Iran today and see, well, I would say don't go to Iran today, okay? Don't go there, but you can look up pictures and see how big they've uncovered some of the citadel that was there that they had fortified around and then built this palace of King Xerxes even upon that. But Xerxes, it tells us that he's over 127 governors or leaders or kings. They all gather here in Shushan. And Xerxes throws a massive party to celebrate his own greatness. That's what he does. In fact, did you hear how long this party was? 180 days. That's 6 months. 6 months of straight partying just to say, I'm pretty great, aren't I? That's what Xerxes did. Now, if you know a lot of what's going on in world history at this time, people did stuff like this all the time. The stories that they were telling, even some of the great stories that we go back to even in school, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written just prior even to this time in history. So people loved grandiose heroes and people and those who conquered. And so it was natural and normal for people like this to celebrate their own greatness. And so that's what Xerxes is doing, celebrating his own greatness for 6 months long with all the big shots in the kingdom. Then, after those 6 months of partying, he decides to throw another 7-day extension of the party that's also extended to all who are in the kingdom, from the greatest even to the small, more insignificant people in the kingdom, it tells us. And this party takes place in the courts of the garden of the king's palace. Then it starts to describe this party for us. Look at verse 6 with me. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. So it's starting to describe for us how beautiful the place was. This is a pretty good venue for a party to take place. A very wealthy, a very rich empire and a very rich king. See, the Persian Empire, they got very rich because they had perfected agriculture. They collectively gathered all the farmers throughout all of the region that they had conquered and created a system that they could actually trade their produce. The Assyrians and the Babylonians before them did not have the incredible wealth and deep economy that the Medo-Persian Empire had. And they were wealthy because of this, but they were also wealthy because of how they conquered the world. If you study out the Assyrians and the Babylonians, how they conquered people, they would take out a city, and then they would cut off the heads of every single male in that city and like basically make a wall around the conquered city with the heads of the males that they had just killed from that city that they had conquered. So they basically were getting rid of every single person that they conquered, and then they would kind of come in and either possess the land and live in the land, or they would bring prisoners to their own land. And that's where we see, like in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel are brought into the Babylonian kingdom. So that's how a lot of times the Assyrians and the Babylonians would conquer. But the Persian Empire, the way that they would conquer is they would take over a land in battle. They would take over, and then they would say, now you can stay here, but this is what you got to do. Pay us a percentage of your produce. Pay us a percentage, basically like a tax system, so that you can invest into the wealth of our empire. But then also as a result, you will become a part of a wealthy empire. And so they got really big, and then they ended up becoming very, very wealthy because of this system. So there's the description of the palace that it's telling us here is not a shock or a surprise to us, right? When you look to how rich they were in this empire. But I want you to see what it tells us next, okay? Because in verse 7, it tells us that they were even more rich than just decorations. It tells us this in verse 7. They served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory. For so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So the drinks, it tells us, were served in golden cups. But not only were they made out of gold, but even it was literally everyone got a gold cup. Even the lowest in the empire got a golden cup. And when you walked away from the party, you didn't have to return the cup. You got to keep the cup. They were so rich, they're like, golden cups for everyone, and you can keep it. That's a souvenir of this awesome party of my awesomeness. Keep the cup, okay? Keep that golden cup. And it tells us this, each cup was different from each other. They were handcrafted. So not only were they gold, none of them looked exactly the same. So it really was a like one-of-a-kind souvenir cup that they had. But then it tells us this, along with this party, there was a lot of alcohol. That's what it says, a lot of alcohol. The drinking was not compulsory. What does that mean? There was no limit. Drink until you're done drinking. How many of you have ever, and I'm not talking about wine, okay? For some reason, gluttonous seems more or better than drunkenness. So I'm going to ask you this. How many of you ever been to an all-you-can-eat buffet? Right? Think of that. You know, like when you walk in and you go, they're going to lose today. That's the kind of idea that you have. You walk into the buffet thinking that, and you walk out miserable, but at least they are too because of how much you took from them. Think about that. These people went in and they're like, the king's wine? Like, all I can drink of the royal personal collection of the king? Oh yeah, he's going to hurt. We're going to do some damage to this guy. And so they're drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking and drinking. There's a lot of inebriation that takes place, and a lot of crazy stuff is going to come of this. You say, what kind of crazy stuff? Well, it doesn't tell us all the details, but it does tell us this, that they were allowed, because of what was taking place, to do whatever pleasured them. Each man's pleasure, they were allowed to do in this party. Do whatever you want for as long as you want. And this ends up setting up a massive fight between the king and the queen. And the fight between the king and the queen actually becomes public. If you're married today, I'm not going to ask, have you ever fought? Because I know you have. But have you ever accidentally taken your fight public? Right? You go in front of other people and it's awkward for everyone. And if you're not married, maybe you've been in that situation where the married couple is making their fight public and you're like, what is happening right now? That's what's taking place here between the king and the queen. This is a very, very public fight, and it's because there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of pride, and there's a lot of perversion taking place. So let's look at what is asked of Queen Vashti in verse 10 and 11. It says this, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that's a nice way of saying he drunk as drunk can be, okay? He commanded, and it tells us all these names of these eunuchs, 7 eunuchs, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Now, when you read it like that, it doesn't sound as bad as it actually is. The implication of the original language this is written in is this: bring Queen Vashti in only her royal crown. In only her royal crown. Before everyone to see. Vashti is summoned in front of the entire nobility to stand there completely modesty outraged. And why? In order to show her beauty before everyone, because of Xerxes' pride and perversion. He was so insecure that he wanted to make sure all the other men found his wife beautiful. I mean, what kind of insecurity does it take to show your wife off in this way? A human being who's created in the image of God to demonstrate this kind of objectification to other men of your wife, as if she's somehow defined by her body. But she's not. Vashti is created also in the image of God and ought not to be treated like this. And it tells us in verse 12 that she refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious and his anger burned within him. She refused to compromise her values and compromise her dignity, because if she did this, she could have kept the riches, she could have kept the power and all that she had, but instead she would not give up her dignity, and she rather refused in bravery for what we find as lesser things. She would rather be given the lesser things that will take place and keep her dignity, her showing more character than this great king. As they're celebrating his greatness, he goes, we come to find out through the course of the story, he's really not that great. He's actually kind of a terrible person. Xerxes demanding this of his wife. Then in verse 13 and 15, because of his anger, it tells us this: Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him, and then it gives us all the names. Sorry, I'm skipping the names. I'm not going to embarrass myself trying to pronounce all of the 12 or so names that he gives. But it says this: all those closest to him who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom, he asked them this: what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs. He says, is there any law that can allow me to do something because she disobeyed my command? And then what we find from verse 16 all the way to verse 20 is that this man named Memucan, what a name, right? Memucan comes up and says, hey, king, if you don't deal with Vashti harshly, if you don't deal with her harshly, then all of the women of the empire will not honor their husbands. Now, he had a very skewed perspective on what honor looks like, because obviously honor to them is do whatever we want, no matter what, as long as it fulfills my pride and pleasure. But that skewed view of honor is what was really driving his decision to say this to the king. And they were afraid of a movement where women would stand up for themselves and not be treated as merely objects of passion, but with human dignity that every human being deserves. And so they were going to come down hard on Vashti so that they could maintain their power, they could maintain their prestige and their pride, and even maintain their perverse thoughts. Little did they know, though, that the hand of God was actually working every one of these details out to bring about a great woman of faith to save God's people. Little did they know, in the middle of all of their debaseness and debauchery, that God was orchestrating these things to bring about the salvation of his people. So this is the kind of setting that we're in. You go, wow, yeah, exactly. And not the wow of like how great a king of Ahasuerus is, more of like, whoa, like that kind of wow. This is not a great setting for this story to take place in, but this is the story in which this is the setting in which our story takes place. But another great element in all good stories is not just knowing the setting or the characters, but also to see foreshadowing take place in a story. In verse 19, as Memucan is giving his idea behind what they should do to come down hard on Queen Vashti, he says this in verse 19: if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. A decree that cannot be revoked is what is presented to King Ahasuerus. Now, this is what I call the MacGuffin in the story, because what we find out is that this quote-unquote insignificant prop of a decree that cannot be revoked, something that's done by the laws of the Persians and the Medes, is something that actually will come back later in the salvation of God's people in the story. So this law cannot be changed. There's no amendments to this law, and that's really important when you come to later parts of the story. But something that we'll see throughout the book of Esther, it also is the foreshadowing of Jesus. Not just the foreshadowing of some things that are going to come up in this short story, but some foreshadowing of our Savior, Jesus Christ. See, good writers are such because they can front load the beginning of the story with a bunch of characters and events and things that foreshadow a greater or better climax and more significant part of the story. All of these things that get introduced in seemingly insignificant ways in the story, later on when the climax of the story takes place, becomes actually very significant things of all the part of the story. And the greatest writer that we know is God. And of course, we know that the Bible is as a whole is a unified historical redemptive story that all points to Jesus. And so what we actually find in the stories of the Bible is that God, the greatest writer of all, front loads his whole story with people and events and objects that take on greater significance as you come to the climax of the story in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And so in the book of Esther, we'll see so many ways that God is putting in foreshadowing, seemingly insignificant people and insignificant objects and events that are actually foreshadowing what Jesus would do in the climax of the whole story of the Bible. And in our first chapter here, we see a lesser King of Kings want to show off his bride in pride and perversion. But when we come to the New Testament, we have a true King of Kings who wants to present his bride not in perversion, but in purity. It tells us in Ephesians that Jesus will present himself a bride who is pure by sanctifying her with the water of the word. So we see an anti-type or an anti-picture through this lesser King of Kings who would like to show off his bride in perversion to show us who the true King of Kings will be like in showing off or presenting his bride in purity. And just kind of a side application for husbands this morning as well. Your wife is not someone to objectify according to your own pride and pleasure. She's a human being created in the image of God who you should in love and honor invest the water of the word of God, into her heart and into her mind that she might be made pure and sanctified through the word. That's how we as husbands, that's the very passage in Ephesians that we find out Jesus does this with his bride, that it's telling us that's what husbands here on this earth are supposed to be doing to their wives. Okay, that was just a bonus application. That wasn't really in my notes, so you're welcome, ladies. But here's the real takeaway that I want us to get from the story, all right? To truly walk away with this today. Even though we don't see God's name throughout the story of Esther, we do see God's presence. We see God's presence. He is always working in the shadows. God is setting everything up for the saving of his people, and we'll see that even more as we continue to unpack this story. See, Xerxes, this king, after he banishes his wife, Vashti, which they end up doing, he banishes her to never come back to the kingdom, and it's like the divorce of all divorces, okay? Not just like we're split up, like you get nothing, you're going, and no one will ever know of who you are again type thing. And after he does this, after he banishes his wife, we know that Xerxes then goes on a war campaign. Now, this part isn't in the Bible. This is what you'd have to kind of look up on your own time in the full story of history, but Chapter 1 of Esther happens in year 3 of Xerxes' reign. It tells us in, I think, verse 3 or 4. And in chapter 2, it tells us that these events that are transpiring in chapter 2 actually happen in year 7 of Xerxes' reign. So there's a 4-year gap between 2 chapters of the Bible that you got to take note of as you're looking. And what happens in between these 2 years of King Xerxes' reign? Well, history tells us. In fact, it's one of the only things that history does tell us about Xerxes. And it tells us this: he goes on a military campaign leading upwards of 300,000 soldiers into different battles. And you know where he leads them? He leads them to the islands of Greece, where he faces 300 Spartans. Maybe you've heard that story, where they kind of defend themselves and hold their own against this great army. And then he ends up after that going to war after war and suffering defeat after defeat after defeat. And old Xerxes comes back with his tail tucked between his legs and starts to end up in a place of loneliness and regret. Loneliness and regret. It tells us, and we'll see this next week, that right at the beginning of chapter number 2, he begins to remember or regret what he had done to Queen Vashti, which then leads this, now he's lonely and he has regret. It actually leads into the hero of this story, Esther, being placed in a position to save God's people. And that's where we're going to pick it up next week, that Esther gets introduced into the story. So even though God isn't mentioned, God is orchestrating all of this. He knows what Xerxes is going to do. He knows what he's going to do in between the time of leaving one wife and then needing a new wife. God knows what's going to happen here, and he's orchestrating all of this and setting everything in place for a great salvation of his people. And it's a beautiful salvation that takes place in this story. And what I want us to take away from it is that this takes place in your story as well. In your story and in my story, almost as if God knows what he's doing, right? He's orchestrating and moving and working even when we can't see it clearly, so that it will all turn out for our good and for his glory. And that good is our sanctification. From the big significant turning points of your life to the seemingly insignificant details of your life. Though it seems at times that that your story is just full of drunkenness and debauchery and deviance, the truth is this: there's really divine intervention taking place. He's working out his purposes, and his purposes are always good. They are always good. So even when you can't see it clearly, let me tell you this: you can trust. You can trust that God is working.